We've been talking about these Bush tax cuts because they're coming up now for renewal. Should we renew them or not? Now, if we do, and now they're tax cuts for all the different brackets. Overall, it would cost our budget over the next 10 years $3.1 trillion. Me personally, I don't think they should be renewed, okay? I don't think they should be renewed for the richest people in the country, but I don't think they should be renewed for any of us, to be honest, because we have a terrible deficit situation, and I'm an actual deficit hawk, unlike the pretend ones you see on television, okay? Now, when they asked liberals, moderates, and Republicans, though, about that, they found some very surprising answers. First, they asked, hey, do you think the tax cuts for the top brackets, the top 2% of the wealthiest people in the country, should they be renewed? So here's what they found out. It is a CNN study, by the way. 9% of liberals said that they favor tax cuts for the rich, which is not surprising. Liberals are generally against tax cuts for the rich, but 9%, maybe the ones that are limousine liberals, were like, not such a good idea. Who knows, right? Now, 26% of moderates said that they favor it, so overwhelmingly moderates are against tax cuts for the rich. But look at that number. 50% of Republicans said, yeah, let's give tax cuts for the rich, but 50% said, hell no, let's not give tax cuts for the rich. Let's not renew those. That is much larger than people would suspect. So you got fully half of the Republican Party, not the politicians, the actual voters, saying, no, let's not renew the tax cuts for the rich. Here's an interesting twist, though. When they asked, hey, how about tax cuts for everyone else? Should that be renewed? Let's look at that. Liberals said 69% of them said, yes, tax cuts for everyone else should be renewed. 53% of moderates said they should be renewed. But look at this. 36% of Republicans said that they should be renewed, meaning a great majority think they should not be renewed. So look, that leads to a couple of different conclusions. First of all, you can argue that the Republicans are being, the voters themselves are being principled, saying, hey, you know what? It's going to screw up the deficit either way, and so I don't want those tax cuts to ruin our fiscal problems and our budget, right? I think that's a very legitimate interpretation, and I give them credit for that. Now, of course, you could look at it and say, wait a minute, more Republicans favor tax cuts for the rich than they do for everyone else. Okay, that's fair too, but overall, what turns conventional wisdom on its head is that a majority of Republicans don't want tax cuts for anybody. A majority say no tax cuts for the 98% of us, and exactly half, say no tax cuts for the rich. So all this idea of, oh, Republicans want tax cuts, Republicans want tax cuts. But if you actually ask the Republican voters, they say, no, we don't. We would rather balance the budget. Look at this, Republicans supportive tax cuts. For the rich, it's only 50%. For everyone else, it's 36%. They don't want the tax cuts. How come nobody ever points that out? That's a very interesting finding. Look, the reason they don't want it, and again, going back and giving them credit here, and if that's the way they voted, which unfortunately they don't, they vote for Republican politicians who stop at nothing to make sure that the rich get their tax cuts. But if the Republican voters got their way, I would be on their side. Look, I agree with them. That's the final result. I mean, I don't think we should get tax cuts for any of these people. Look, we're in a state where our budget is a disaster. To give away $3.1 trillion, look, I think those Republican voters are saying we're not convinced that it's going to help the rich stimulate the economy, but we're not convinced that it's going to help stimulate the economy for the rest of us either. And generally speaking, I agree with them. And if you look at the numbers, and we've showed you these numbers in the past as to what stimulates the economy the most, it's things like unemployment benefits and food stamps, because they get spent right away. So they have a larger multiplier on the economy. They positively affect the rest of the economy. If you give tax cuts, whether it's for the rich, which has the worst multiplier, or for the rest of us, it still has a bad multiplier because a lot of people save their tax cuts, so it doesn't stimulate the economy. So the bottom line on this is twofold. One, Republican voters are not in favor of tax cuts, so stop saying that. And number two, I agree with the Republican voters. Now, number three, the Republican politicians do not represent the Republican voters. Do I agree with the Republican politicians? Hell no. Because they're on the exact opposite, saying, we have to have the tax cuts no matter what. In fact, perfect example is Mitch McConnell on Meet the Press. David Gregory keeps asking him and asking him, putting him in a corner, right? And look at how he tries to weasel his way out, but he can't. Let's go to clip number 2.
But my question is, how do you pay for an extension of tax cuts? Because if you're concerned, as Republicans say they are, about cutting spending and the deficit, you have to acknowledge that tax cuts are net paid for.
Well, what are you talking about? Pay for? This is existing tax policy. It's been in place for 10 years. What they're talking about is raising taxes, impacting 50% of small business income in the middle of what most Americans think is a recession. That is not a responsible thing to do, in my judgment.
But it's still borrowed money. The CBO senator this week made it very clear that the long-term picture for the economy, for the deficit, is very dark if you extend the Bush-era tax cuts without somehow paying for them.
Look, what we're talking about here is tax increases in the middle of a recession. We're going to have the third year in a row under this administration of an annual deficit of more than $1 trillion. That is not because we are taxing too little, David. It's because we're spending too much.
But, Senator, with respect, you're being unresponsive to a question, which is, are tax cuts paid for going forward, or is it borrowed money at a time when you and other Republican leaders say we must get serious about the deficit? It's a straightforward question.
Yeah, I know, and I gave you a straightforward answer. What we're talking about here is raising taxes in the middle of what most Americans think is a recession. That isn't going to produce more revenue. We've got a serious job loss problem in this country.
For a final time, I'll go back to my question, which is the extension of the tax cuts would cost $3.2 trillion. That's borrowed money. That adds to the deficit. Do you have a plan to pay for that extension?
You're talking about current tax policy. Why did it all of a sudden become something that we, quote, paid for?
Oh, it's great, man. Did you catch that last part? He's like, all of a sudden, why do we have to pay for tax cuts for the rich? The current policy under Bush and then the last couple of years under Obama is we don't pay for tax cuts for the rich. We just add that to the deficit and the debt, and eventually we turn around and go, oh, sorry, we spent all the money, and so we can't pay your Social Security. It's like, all of a sudden, why are you demanding we pay for it? By the way, you want to know the numbers? What David Gregory alluded to there? And by the way, very good job of asking follow-up questions by David Gregory. That was, challenging the government. That was nicely done, okay? Now, by 2014, right now our deficit is $1.342 trillion, right? If we do not extend the Bush tax cuts for anybody, the budget deficit by 2014, in 4 years, will go down to $438 billion. Now that sounds like a lot, but it's almost $1 trillion less than where we are now, and it would be a pretty manageable 2.5% of the GDP. Okay, hey, I can live with that. I'd rather have it be balanced, but 2.5% of the GDP is workable, okay? So that's why I'm not in favor of extending the tax cuts for anybody, okay? Now, if you do what the Republicans want, and you extend the tax cuts for everybody, including the richest Americans, and you get rid of the estate taxes they want, the estate tax over the next 10 years, if we got rid of it, would also cost the budget $262 billion. You put that together, you know what it would do? It would about double our deficit. It would double our deficit. And these guys pretend that they want balanced budgets. Do you understand what's going on here? They are unremittent liars. Gregory did a very good job there of putting them in a corner and saying, what is it? It's going to raise a deficit, isn't it? It's going to raise a deficit, isn't it? You're not paying for it, are you? He says, oh, come on, you're being silly. Why would I pay for tax cuts for the rich? I'm a Republican. Look, they're the Richie Rich party. That's what they are. And just everybody understand it. And if you're in the top 2%, you might want to vote for a Republican. If you're not, you got to get your head examined. Okay, I'm not done yet. Now, you think those are the Republicans that are terrible. No, I'm not letting the Democrats off the hook. So in the middle of this debate, which we have thoroughly won, what do you think is going to happen? Of course, Democrats bailing out. Running for office, Robin Carnahan in Missouri, Jack Conway in Kentucky, all Democratic candidates, Brad Ellsworth in Indiana, and Charlie Melancon in Louisiana, all Senate candidates, all Democrats, all saying we should extend tax cuts for the very rich, and agreeing with the Republicans. But even the Republican voters don't think that. Why are you saying that? Only two possible reasons. One, you're getting the same money from those same rich folks, and so under the guise of, oh, I live in a red state, oh, I have to be more conservative, you just take their cash and then you sell out your voters. Or you're so profoundly stupid that you believe the Republican talking points that doesn't even represent the Republican voters, let alone all of the voters. It doesn't even come close to it. And you're so pathetic that you bowed your head without even knowing what the facts are. So I asked those Democrats, which one is it? Because I'm not sure. So you tell me, which one is it?